right into LSU and Notre Dame. Both of these teams, fan bases are pretty familiar with us this year. We've covered a ton of Notre Dame games. We've covered a ton of LSU games. And now they're playing one another. And they met not too long ago. That was an interesting game. Notre Dame won that one. A lot more high scoring than I think either team was comfortable with at the time. But these are two completely different teams now. LSU's kind of rolling into this game with some momentum, 9-3 on the year, which is, probably a better year than they expected after that Troy game. And for some reason, I think it's funny, LSU hasn't been able to shake off the Troy loss, even though there were so many things about that game that were just kind of a bad timing, bad scenario, Murphy's Law sort of situation for them. And Troy turned out to be a pretty good team. But that game has been the benchmark for Ohio State fans or whatever non-SEC fans to say, look, Alabama's best win lost to Troy or whatever. And you can play that game all day long. But LSU now, like I said, has a little momentum since that Troy game. The only game they lost was to Alabama. So they drilled Texas A&M, they drilled Tennessee, drilled Arkansas. None of these games were close, so they're kind of playing to their talent level. And in comes a Notre Dame team that had some success against Georgia, slowed them down, played them really close. That was a nail biter. Had stubbed their toe against Miami, but has played in these big time games on this big stage and is not going to be scared of LSU. So let's get into this game. I want you to tell me, to start this off, what is the most likely opportunity for Notre Dame to expose LSU and take advantage of them? And tell me what's the most likely opportunity for LSU to expose Notre Dame in this game and take advantage of them.
I think the most likely opportunity for Notre Dame to expose LSU is LSU has struggled at times, oddly enough, defensively this season against teams that were balanced and had a good rushing attack. Now, they got healthy at the end of the year, and they started doing a lot better. But they would give up 20 points or more, and they did it against Syracuse. They did it against Troy, Auburn, Ole Miss, and Alabama in that stretch in the middle of the year. It's notable, like you talked about, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas A&M. Those were all teams with offenses that were kind of imploding, in just teams overall that were imploding at the end of the season. And I do think there's some potential that, much like what we saw with the LSU Florida game, LSU can stiffen up off front and they can stop teams running the ball. But then you go back a week prior, Troy really had their way at the line of scrimmage, and that's how they won that game. And they really had the same issues with Syracuse passing attack the week prior. I don't know. I think Notre Dame could sort of shock LSU there a little bit, and people will probably say I'm crazy for saying that. I will say LSU, when healthy, again, has been a different team. But that's a possibility. I think the other thing is, and I say that because the flip side is so obvious that if you stop LSU's rushing attack, their offense can really kind of struggle. And when you look at the teams they played, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas A&M, their run defenses were quite bad. A&M's had been really good early in the year, and they just kind of fell apart. But Arkansas and Tennessee, their run defenses were pretty abysmal. Ole Miss, same way. The teams that had good run defenses, Florida, Auburn, Alabama, they struggled to hit 20 points in those games. They only did it once. And Mississippi State has a pretty good front that at times can control the run, and Mississippi State destroyed them. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, if you've got a mobile quarterback and you can get on the edges, I don't know that Mississippi State game in this beginning of the year was such an aberration. And Notre Dame has a kind of similar player in a lot of ways that can really strain them the way Fitzgerald did and force them to play a little bit out of their comfort zone. And I'm not sure how good they really are at the linebacker position, outside their star. I'm not really sure how well they handle things at times. And you're asking me how they would shock them. Now, I'm not saying this is likely, but I think that is a possible outcome, and it is a way that Notre Dame could shock LSU. I think the flip side of that, though, is LSU could be extremely stout against the run. They could come up against press. And if LSU is really stout against the run and Notre Dame has to pass, they've had problems. And the thing I know you didn't really necessarily want to bring up, I think you have to give a pretty heavy ear to Notre Dame's skid. We'll get in the model in a second, which is actually quite favorable to Notre Dame. The real question here is Notre Dame has not responded well when they've played a team that could punch them in the mouth. Is this game going to be different than those games?
And it's interesting too because they didn't. We look back to the Georgia game and we see that Notre Dame had a loss, and in some ways they didn't respond well in terms of putting points on the board. So they ran into that in Miami where they couldn't score, and it sort of snowballed. But if we look at, is this a fair comparison? If we look at Notre Dame's offense, where they have a quarterback that's very mobile, a great runner, and can make some really good throws, but consistently isn't a great passer, how similar could we say LSU, if we're looking for a touch point for LSU versus a similar offense, is Alabama's offense with Jalen Hurts kind of similar in that? Because got great running backs. Some would say a good running back playing quarterback for Alabama. Is that a fair assessment? Not talking about defense or anything else for Notre Dame, just offensively in terms of scheme and capability. And the fact that, they put up 24 points on LSU, is that a fair comparison?
I think it probably is. I think there's a lot of similarities between Wimbush and Hurts. They both kind of had their issues in some of the bigger games. I will say what's different in my view is that Wimbush takes a little more risks and will put the ball vertically more than Hurts. Now that's a low bar. We've talked about this before, that we both feel like Alabama is suffering horribly because they have a quarterback that's gotten scared to pull the trigger and throw the ball vertically, even though they have a significant advantage at receiver against almost everybody they play. Probably, honestly, the receiving core has an advantage over any team in the country, but no one sees it because of the quarterback play. Wimbush is a lot more willing to pull the trigger. They just kind of have the opposite problem. They don't have a receiving core that's necessarily dominant. I mean, I know I'm see if I can say the name right. Equanimous St. Brown is an excellent receiver, and I don't want to take away from that, but the depth they have at the position, I think if you want to draw the line, I don't know that their run game is as deep, and I don't know that the receivers are as deep. I think the starters, the named guys like St. Brown, like Wimbush, Adams, are probably just as good. I think maybe the line might actually be a little bit better, the offensive line. The problem is Alabama's got I think three more guys that were number one receivers overall that are backups at this point. You guys like Judy and Robert Foster. And Notre Dame does not have those guys. They don't have 6 5-star receivers sitting there and 4 or 5-star tailbacks backing up the starter. That's where it differs. But when you play LSU, you don't generally play a lot of snaps. So one of the things that can come into play is if your starters are really good, you can kind of shine. Because if LSU isn't able to lean on you with their offense and really build up a time of possession advantage, they tend to burn a lot of clock, and you don't have to rotate as much as you would against some teams. And in that regard, I think Notre Dame probably is a fair comparison.
All right, so I want to I don't know that it's completely fair to do in terms of assessment of Notre Dame, but I want to kind of throw out the Miami game. Let's forget what happened in that game. I think it benefits us because we predicted it to go the other way. But let's talk about the Stanford game. And tell me, how concerned are you if you're a Notre Dame fan and Stanford, you're looking at a Stanford team that scored 17 against Cal, 21 against Washington State, 15 against Oregon State. I know they had some quarterback injury problems and Love didn't play that game. A team that struggled consistently all year to score points. And then they match up with Notre Dame and they beat them 38-20. How concerned are you that your defensive performance throughout the year is more a reflection of who you played and not necessarily that your defense is that good?
I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned to the point that, you're bringing this up, and we try to do, well, partially we do this on the fly because we don't have any time and this isn't our day jobs, but we also partially do it to try to gauge each other's reactions real time. And everything we say is a lot of times sort of off the cuff and our own base knowledge. I had the Notre Dame Stanford box score pulled up as the next thing I wanted to talk about before you brought this up. Because in my view, this is probably the biggest indicator of the way this game's going to go. Stanford is a team that uses a tremendous amount of line motion and a big offensive line to lean on teams that has had shaky issues with their passing game, in their case because the quarterback isn't very good and they have some limited targets at receiver, and they were able to put up 38 points on Notre Dame. There's not a lot, in my opinion, this year that Stanford does offensively that LSU is probably not better at. And I know a lot of people will say I'm crazy because Bryce Love is such a good player. Stanford has the advantage of playing teams that are really bad at stopping the run on a frequent basis, and they have an elite running back. No matter how good the running back is, and this is really a pro point, if you don't have a serious advantage in the trenches, he can only do so much, because if he's being met by a 300-pound lineman, no back is ever going to be completely dominant. LSU has in Geis a player that, in my opinion, is probably about as good as Love. And he's a different sort of player. He's not as fast. He's more bruising.
They might have two
I
running backs as good as Love.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think at quarterback, it's probably a little bit of a wash. And LSU is considerably better at receiver than Stanford. Then you combine that with the fact that they run what is now a very similar offense under Canada with a tremendous amount of shifts. It's incredibly concerning because I don't think Stanford was really a great team. I was kind of surprised that Stanford beat Notre Dame, and a little bit, it's hard to put my finger on. I think a lot of it is probably a function of who they played. I think we kind of know in retrospect. For example, we know North Carolina isn't very good. We know Temple's not any good. Michigan State might be okay. We're not really sure. They weren't good start of the year. North Carolina State's been beaten a few too many times. They had a tough game against Wake, who's been just pretty much average. The big game they had was they destroyed USC. They did it by running the ball and really getting USC out of rhythm, and kind of running away with it until USC couldn't come back.
And
And
Wimbush
USC came
was uncharacteristically awesome through the air in that game too.
True. But the flip side is that USC has not really had a lot of sustained success against good teams running the football. They've relied probably way too much on Darnold's arm in comeback wins against, for example, when they're playing Texas. They couldn't really run the ball at all in that game with any consistent success. They had to win the game late using Darnold to sort of edge it. And when they played Miami, when they played Stanford, I think they got exposed. I mean, the defense kind of got run over. And if you look at the last 4 games of the season, 37 points to Wake, 41 points to Miami, 17 against Navy, who's pretty bad this year, and 38 against Stanford. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real serious concern. And,
So,
you know,
and one specific thing on this that I'd love for you to talk about, because I've heard you talk about it before, and it's really interesting to me, especially as it plays into our model. And we're about to get to the model. I promise y'all we're going to talk about it in a second. If you just look at the statistics from the Notre Dame game against Stanford. So, yes, Notre Dame had 3 turnovers, and that played into a lot of Stanford's ability to score, although they had a number of long drives in that game as well. Stanford was 2 for 11 on third down, and they were outgained. So Notre Dame was 8 for 19. Notre Dame almost outgained Stanford by 100 yards. Talk about how important scoring efficiency is and how it's plagued LSU in the past, and we might be seeing some of that as well in Notre Dame, where statistically they're outperforming teams that are beating them pretty bad. What does that say about scoring efficiency, and how might it, rear its head in this game?
we've talked about it a lot. The more dependent you are generally with the run, the more yardage you have to get per point. I feel like that's something that would seem counterintuitive to some people, maybe. It's the issue is that passing offenses, when you complete a pass, is it more yards than a run? Yes. The problem is when you're running the ball, it's hard to get chunk plays. It's hard to break have a single play go for a touchdown. You have to sustain a drive. And if you get 6, 7, 8 yards per play on average running the ball, it's easy to think that you're just going to run it down and score it every time. But the truth is, even at 7 yards per carry, occasionally you're going to take a loss. And let's say you're averaging 6.5 yards per carry. If you're averaging 6.5 yards per carry and you ever take a 2 yard loss, ever, now it's 2nd and 12, and you're unlikely to generate that first down. So it's tough for teams that go to a run first offense to win in some instances. They tend to generate a higher per play average. I've lamented for a while that the run spread offense is really good at getting you to 9 wins because it tends to dominate teams where you have a talent advantage when you're not playing very good teams. And when you play really good teams, all of a sudden that can disrupt your backfield. And I lament this going all the way back. It was always my complaint about Oregon under Chip Kelly. When they would play good defenses, they tend to kind of fold. And it's really the disruption with the offense because they can't sustain drives, and the fact that the defense reacts too well for them to get an edge and get the big chunk plays they need. Notre Dame sort of adopted that, and scoring efficiency has been an issue. And you look back at it and on a lot of their yardage totals. I mean, they averaged over 8 yards per um, 3 times over the course of the season, and that's a pretty crazy number. Now they put up a lot of points in those games, but you know, repeatedly when you're getting 8.1 against Temple and 7.8 against Boston College, I mean it's great. And then you go back and you look at the numbers a little closer, and it's like, well, what happened when they played a really good team? Well, against Georgia, they only had 3.4 yards per play. Against Miami, they only had 4.1. And then when they were a little more middling, when they had 5.7 yards per play against Stanford, they only had 20 points. When they had 5.5 against North Carolina, they jumped up to 33. And then everything else was kind of more yardage than that, and the points started taking off. But the point being, when they're being held under 6 yards per play, the offense is not nearly as effective in terms of scoring because it just has too many problems sustaining drives. Now, the Stanford game also, there's 3 turnovers, so you got to factor that in. But at the same time, this is the same problem we've talked about all year for LSU, and they've heard this like a broken record. If you're really, really, really dependent on the run to sustain drives, the problem is you tend to also be really susceptible to any sort of false start, negative play, tackle for loss, disrupting drives, and it takes a lot of successful plays to generate one score. And so you really need a lot of yardage per play to overcome any negative plays in order to sustain a scoring drive.
All right, so we've talked about efficiency, we've talked about matchups. Let's go ahead and get in the computer model and let me know what it says.
Okay, so 15-second version. The model is per play averages, not total averages. And we look at how you do versus how your opponents allowed the other teams they've played to do. Basically, what was your performance against your opponents versus how your opponents did against everybody else? We use that as a baseline for your team, and then we compare, project how you'll do against the team you're playing, and then look at historical data to say, okay, based off our projection of how you're going to do in this game, historically, this season, how would you have fared with that kind of output offensively and defensively? First thing we always usually note is how much of opponent defensive averages you allow, or how much defensively of opponent averages you allow. Meaning, um, if another team averages 4 yards per carry and you allow 3.5 yards per carry, then you're allowing 87% of their rush averages. So LSU is not as good defensively as one might think. A lot of it is due to the competition they faced. They're allowing 87% of opponent rush averages and 90% of opponent pass averages. We generally say anything 90 to 95 is solid. You really have to be below 90 to be good. And to be very good, you need to be below 85 in either characteristic. And so they're merely solid to good. They are not a great defense by any means statistically. And Notre Dame actually is a lot better. They're 82% of opponent rush averages and 81% of opponent pass averages. So 5 percentage points better against the run, 10 percentage points better against the pass versus their competition. Big asterisk here, it's very difficult and when I say difficult, I mean statistically impossible for us to control right now in interconference play. The reason being there's so few cross conference games, there is nowhere near enough data to adjust for it. It's affecting everybody that's doing a computer model this year, particularly because none of the good teams happen to play each other in interconference games. Here's my first caveat here, okay? So we talk about LSU having about 87, 80, 90% of opponent averages. They played way too much of the season without Rashard Lawrence or Arden Key. LSU has done significantly better than those averages in later games. So I think that's the first caveat here, is LSU's statistics are probably a little bit screwy. Now, when we take all this and we reject it, knowing our current statistics, um, one of the main things to keep in mind is that Notre Dame's rushing attack has been dominant, averaging 6.4 yards per carry in the season. LSU, even though they're a renowned run team, only averaging 4.86 yards per carry in the season. They haven't really been that successful. And for that reason, Notre Dame is expected to outgain LSU by a significant margin, 5.7 yards per play to just 5.1 for LSU, over a half a yard advantage. When you plot that historically, LSU's projection versus Notre Dame's, Notre Dame is predicted to score about 25 points off their 5.7 yards per play. LSU projected to only score 16, so it's predicting a 25-16 Notre Dame win over LSU. Again, though, I have to have a huge caveat. LSU's statistics are based very heavily, all of this stuff is based off the fact that LSU's defense was not very good for the middle and early part of the year when Lawrence wasn't in the lineup, when they were without, I think, 3 or 4 defensive linemen, and when Arden Key was either not playing at all or was playing and was horribly out of shape.
And Notre Dame fans are going to say, yeah, we've had injuries too. I think the Arden Key one's a big deal because even when he was playing early, we saw that he just wasn't ready. And I think he started rounding out a little bit in the Auburn game, and it has made a tremendous impact for them. But also some of the defensive line getting short up. At the end of the year, the thing for me, and you mentioned the defensive players getting better. Here's the one that's going to surprise you a little bit. Maybe you'll disagree. I'm going to go ahead and give my gut score. I think LSU wins this game. And look, I've been really impressed with Notre Dame this year, and we've picked them to win a lot of games. We came away really impressed with them after the Georgia game. I don't think this is a good matchup for them. I think Notre Dame's actually a better team than the 2 losses they've showed this year. I think LSU wins this game, mostly because I think LSU is going to be able to stop Notre Dame's rushing attack. But the key for me, surprisingly, is how Danny Etling played down the stretch. And for LSU fans who watch this show, they know we've not pulled any punches with Danny Etling. I mean, we've not been real high on him for 2 years now. The way he played down the stretch, the last few games, I was really impressed, and I felt like he was playing with a lot of confidence. He was making some really good throws. And if we want to compare this to the Georgia team that Notre Dame faced, it would be like Georgia early in the year with Fromm versus how Fromm was playing at the end of the year, where he kind of got his sea legs. I think. Tell me if I'm crazy. I think Danny Etling is going to be the difference in this game. Am I crazy?
I think you might be a little bit crazy. Now, I will say he played at a much higher level, right, in his last few games, particularly in the Texas A&M game. I think a lot of it you put on Etling, but I do think there's a little bit of a classic case here that the quarterback takes too much credit and too much blame. The LSU receivers have been very up and down this season, and Chark and Gage played at a much better level at the end of the year than they were early in the year. They were super inconsistent. To a certain extent, I think the receiving core is one of the big reasons that they were let down in the Mississippi State game because they didn't get separation. They didn't make plays when they were available to them. But I guess my counter to your point, well, there's really 2 counters. One, he had 2 really good games against Arkansas and A&M, where he averaged 13.6 yards per play and 11.3 yards per attempt. Not even per completion. Against Arkansas, he averaged 14 yards per attempt. But sandwiched between those two games was an Alabama game where he averaged 5 yards per attempt and a Tennessee game where he only averaged 5.4 yards per attempt. Now, the Tennessee game they didn't have to do a lot, but I think you have to remember Arkansas secondary was pretty bad, and A&M secondary was considered their Achilles heel all year. Tennessee's is actually quite good statistically all season. The problem is they couldn't stop anybody from running the ball, so it didn't matter. But I think the important thing here is Notre Dame's relative strength is against the pass. They're a very good pass defense. They have been all year. Their weakness is the run. I don't think it's wise, and I don't think LSU will lean on Danny Etling. I think he could be very successful in a play action sense, but if they're going to beat Notre Dame, they're going to do it running the football. I think the only way Etling is successful is if Notre Dame sells out to the run to such an extent that they compromise themselves. And I just don't think I don't think the way Kelly's defended things in the past, he tends to play things very vanilla. I just don't think they're likely to do that.
But what I guess in my estimation, or the way I'm looking at this, is how we saw. Let's take Georgia again. Georgia versus Auburn first time versus Georgia versus Auburn the second time. We talked a lot about how if you play a good team and you're a run first team, at some point down the line you're going to play a team that take away your run game, at least neutralize it for the most part. At that point, you need a quarterback that can make just enough plays to keep the defense honest to allow your run game to operate. And that's what I'm saying with Danny Etling here, is that they're not going to be able to shut him down completely, which means that if they sell out for the run, which I think they might have to do to stop the run, he's going to be able to be able to operate a little bit and be the difference maker. So I'm not ready to give the guy the Heisman, but I think that we talk about, again, a run first team. I think he's going to be able to do some things to either keep Notre Dame honest or punish them for selling out for the run. All right, enough about Danny Etling. Give me your gut score. I'm going to round this one out.
My gut score in it, I do think this one's tough. I think it's close. We picked Notre Dame to beat USC quite badly early in the year. I picked Notre Dame to beat Miami, and that one was wrong. I did pick them to lose to Georgia, but we've generally been quite high on Notre Dame. I just think they're in a skid, and I don't usually give into that whole sort of concept, but in this case, I think it's true. They've got a lot of time to rebound, but again, to me, it's the similarities offensively with Canada's shifts and motions compared to how they struggled with a lot of unbalanced lines and similar concepts against Stanford. It's really concerning. I also think LSU, now that they're healthy, is tremendously better defensively than they were early in the year. So I'm gonna go against the model. I'm gonna go against hard, and it's really not SEC homerism. It's more you have two teams that I think are just headed in very, very different directions. I have LSU 31, Notre Dame 14.
Yowzers. I could see that if the game sort of starts heading the way that I keep dropping my pen. That's like 2 videos now that I've dropped my pen. If the game goes the way that Miami game went, where they come in and they need that 5.5, 6 yards of carry from Adams to have Wimbush be able to do anything, and it doesn't happen, I can see it getting out of hand. I'm gonna go. I think Etling is the difference maker, but I still don't think it's a blowout or anything like that. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go 24-21. I think that's a good one. 24-21 LSU, and I'm gonna round it out unless you've got anything else to discuss on this one.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that both of us have LSU, even though they're a 2-score underdog in the model. Everything the model is saying is screaming at us that Notre Dame's the better team, and I just really want to reemphasize the fact that if Notre Dame played at their potential, I might pick them. I would pick them in a close win. I'm just really concerned that they are not playing anywhere close to the potential at the end of the year. And I've seen the other half of this that I didn't bring up is when LSU was on point, and really the last couple times they played Alabama, their ability to generate pressure off the edge with guys like Jackson and Arden Key and Devin White and their active defensive front has just given running quarterbacks fits. And they did it last year in the bowl game against Lamar Jackson, where they pretty much shut him down. It's an extremely difficult team to play with a running quarterback because their edge players are so dynamic and so fast and so disruptive that the quarterback has a really hard time getting to the edge or escaping the pocket and making anything happen. It's a lot like playing an NFL team with a dual threat quarterback. The dual threat quarterback's still just not quite good enough to outrun the elite, purpose-built edge players. And that's kind of why I have to feel like I want to give a serious edge to LSU in this game.
I think it's a fair point. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Notre Dame won this game. I wouldn't. I just think right now I buy into it a little more than you, and I have for 2 years now. I think they're trending in opposite directions, and I don't know. I think this is one of those games where the rah-rah motivator coach can get them excited, even though it's not a playoff game or anything like that. So, interesting one. I can't wait to see it. Y'all, give us your scores in the comments. But also, Notre Dame fans, tell us, who do you think your MVP is going to be if you win? And tell us how you're going to stop LSU, because we've been saying a lot of this right here, and we could be completely wrong, and we're happy for you to tell us why. All right, y'all, thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.